welcome back to another vlog by me. Today we have a double whammy with chapter 6 in this and chapter 6 in this. So we're gonna go to chapter 6 in the Rhetorical Act, and I'm gonna teach you what it taught me. Now, so this is the resources of organization, and organization is super important because if you don't have organization, it is a big blob of words and it's very hard to find the meaning in it. Now, we start out our papers with the thesis. And the thesis is a simple sentence that is very purposeful, and it discusses what you will be talking about and your stance on what you are talking about in this essay. And then there's outlining. There's outlining, which is typically a visual representation of how you're going to put all these topics together and how you're going to relate them to one another, and what are you going to use to support those points that you're using in your argument to support your overall thesis. Woo. So there's different forms of organizing. This one's my favorite. Chronological sequencing. Oh, I love it. It's super easy to read. That's my favorite. But if you haven't gotten that by now. But so there's chronological, narrative, and spatial. Chronological treats a subject by, it just goes through time, and this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Narrative is like a storyline. Just kind of like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I don't know. And then there's spatial, which treats it it says treats a subject in a directional pattern, which it helps the audience visualize this subject. And audiences can typically anticipate the sequence with spatial sequencing. And then there is topical structure, which you break down your argument into little parts, little subjects, and you talk about your subject in terms of these parts or perspectives. And so each one of your body paragraphs will typically be a new part, unless it's super zoomed in, then it's going to be each little thing. But anyways, then there's logical structures, which is usually cause and effect, or there's a problem and a solution. So you're saying that, like, this happened, so logically this happened, or this happened, so logically I propose that our solution is this, because logically it makes sense. So causal, cause and effect, problem, solution. And then there's your introductions and your conclusions. And your introductions are primarily getting your audience involved and wanting to know more, and establishing that relationship between the audience and the author, and also the subject, so that, yes, they want to learn about it. And then the conclusion is restating some of your, like, main claims that are in your thesis, and just overall giving your audience that last thing, like, I'm gonna leave you with this so that you can remember that this was something that was a main point that you should think about from my overall speech or article. So that was chapter 6 in the Rhetorical Act, and now we're going to chapter 6 in reading pop culture. Let's see. What's our first one? Our first one is The Imagination of Disaster by Susan Sontag. So, life involves two things: unremitting banality and an inconceivable amount of terror. And the way people cope with these two things being so much, is that science fiction is a great way to disappear from the real world and get lost in a good book or a movie. But so science fiction is actually really predictable. It's almost as predictable as Western movies, which it's pretty much bang bang, you're dead. Next. No, I don't know. But so science fictions are probably the most accomplished in this, compared to a lot of genres. And so based on this, I'm going to go through what typically happens in a science fiction. And yeah, because that's a lot Susan talked about, Susan Sontag, in this article. So something usually arrives, there's a spaceship, and of course only one person sees it, so nobody believes him. And even though this sounds related or unrelated, it will be related later. He typically has a girlfriend. Yeah, so remember that for later. And then there's finally confirmation where other people are finally believing him. People finally see this spaceship in the middle of the forest or whatever it is. And then the local authorities always try to peacefully see what it wants, try to get it to leave. Never ends well. These local authorities typically get slaughtered. Then we realize we need the real government, not just local authorities. We need the Washington, D.C., national, and even international people, international governments. And typically this hero, which is the first guy that saw whatever thing arrived, he's usually leading the discussions, and there's scientists from all over the world, and they find a plan to destroy the enemy. And then the girlfriend's in danger, and the public is panicking because there is a counterattack by the opponent, and it's chaos. Lots of fighting. And then we get number 5, where they need to find the person's weakness because the plan didn't work, and they need to find the weakness that these aliens have, or I don't know. And of course, almost always the hero has been working on a prototype nuclear type weapon that will get rid of this thing that is putting the people he loves in harm's way. And so it's a prototype, never been tested, never been used. It works. Everybody cheers, and then they question, is that the last of them? Which depends on if they want to make a sequel. And then there's also a smaller one where something happens. There's a plant that grows really big. I don't know. This is typically when there's like a family camping. But so then the family or the dad or maybe even the kids, they go and they look closer and they follow some tracks that they left, or I don't know. But they're trying to figure out what this thing is, similar to the other thing. And so they attempt to tell authorities. Sometimes it works, but they get slaughtered like in the first one, or they just can't. They don't have cellular service and it doesn't work. But so the third one is the thing starts claiming victims. So like there's a plant eating people it's claiming victims. But so number 4, which is the resolution, is it's either done alone and on accident, that the hero finds the weakness and kills the human-eating plant, or they're somehow able to contact actual authorities that know how to deal with this type of issue. So with that, sometimes good novels, very rarely, create good film, but typically a good novel creates a bad film, and a bad film creates a bad novel creates a good film. So it's typically flip-flop, and that's a lot what she's talking about in here. But then she likes to go in and make sure that she makes sure to say that science fiction is not about science. It's about disaster. And any good movie takes place in multiple settings, but it's not science. And it's not horror, so it's all just disaster and the fear of being taken over, which that fear doesn't really change from in different time periods, but so there's always gonna be kind of science fiction-y novels and things like that. So yeah, so now we're gonna go to Osterwell's Hollywood love affair with surveillance. Hollywood's love affair with surveillance, and it discusses a lot about how, what was his name? Edward Snowden showed a bunch of things like, oh, the government's watching us, NSA, different things like that. But surveillance in media has been around for like at least the past 15 years before any of Snowden's revelations. We seem to really like surveillance, and it's almost comforting to us. They show in RoboCop how this RoboCop knows everything, and it drops the crime rate down by 90%, which to some people that sounds amazing, but to few, they don't want people to know everything about them. And then there's Her, which is a very interesting thing, because a guy kind of falls in love with this thing that's watching him, but it's AI, it's artificial intelligence. But so that talks a lot about patriarchy and feeling totally alienated from our desire and our bodies, and that's kind of why we enjoy this surveillance and we're okay with it. And finally, there was Captain America, where it talks about this surveillance and how knowing a lot of things about, like, knowing everything, total surveillance, could lead to crazy massacres and all these different things, but also the only way to stop that is to have this total surveillance, which is like, I don't know, it's like how I was talking about 1920 is the age of anxiety, where people go, oh, there's a problem, but here's a solution, when really there wasn't really a problem or a need for it. So in this, you're saying there's not really a need for this total surveillance, but by having it, we could defend ourselves from something that wouldn't have happened except for the fact that we have this. So, I don't know. That's your last hope kind of thing, but... our next one is Has Hollywood Murdered the Movies by David Denby. And so it talks a little bit about movies and people going to the movies. And in the 1930s, 80 million people went to the movies per week. And it peaked at 90 million people mid-1940s. But now we have 2.5 times the population that we had then. And it went down, which is very surprising because you would think that with more people would go to the movies. But it's dropped more than half. So now it's only 30 million people per week go to the movies. And it's interesting because things like in 2013, the Avengers made $20 million, or they used $20 million to make a movie that made $1.5 billion. And then we'll back up, and 2010 Iron Man 2 made $622 million, which was 3 times the budget of the future movie. So they made a lot of money off of these. But most of these movies, like Avengers, Iron Man 2, it's all about saving the world, and it's these big things, and we want our world to be saved. It's incredible. It's huge, and it's significant. And so we have these movies out here that are big and significant, and then we have other ones that aren't as big and significant, and we're kind of wondering what's the point. But then these big and significant life-changing movies, not life-changing, like if we weren't saved, our lives would be changed. But they're very trivial movies, and we forget that originally adults were the ones that went to the movies, and sometimes kids were dragged along. But now they're marketed towards kids, and there's a ton of children's movies, and there's even more teenage movies, and then there's less adult movies now. And so we're beginning to think there's not much in these movies because they're not for adults and they're not thought-provoking anymore. They're just, like we said a few vlogs back, is the hero rises, the hero falls, and the hero rises again. And it doesn't matter who the hero is or who they're fighting, but it's just the constant same plot. But they also feel like if movies were to have meaning to them and be about something, then people might get offended by them. And it's kind of a shame because honestly, we get offended by too many things nowadays, and maybe we do need a movie that shouldn't offend people, but probably will. So it's just now our movies are so empty, and we go to the movies just because something came out, not because we actually wanted to see the movies. So really, has Hollywood murdered the movies? Because these big, extravagant movies don't even have a theme anymore. They're not teaching. They're the same movies over and over again. Our author leaves us with, however, not all is lost. There are some independent movies that have been really successful in the past few years, and it's gaining more funding for future ones. There's some really talented directors out there that we all need to remember that scripts are very important, because if we don't have a script, then there's no point to the movie, really. And yeah, going to the movies and having it be meaningful, it has very much decreased. And yeah, that is everything. I will see you in my next vlog. Bye.